The war, for most American soldiers, was fought across 10,000 miles, in the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta and the triple canopy jungles of the Central Highlands. It was measured in blood, heat, and the ever-present threat of the unseen enemy. But for 2.7 million men and women, the most brutal, disorienting battlefield was not in Southeast Asia. It was one they never expected: the terminal floor of a U.S. civilian airport. Consider the experience of a young corporal. Let's call him David, from Des Moines. Just 48 hours earlier, he'd been pulling guard duty near Da Nang, the smell of cordite and diesel fuel heavy in the air. His survival was governed by instinct, measured in millimeters and milliseconds. The sounds of his life were the snap of a twig, the thump-thump of a helicopter, and the metallic clatter of his own weapon. In Vietnam, a soldier fought a unique conflict, the 365-day war. There was no cohesive, collective end date. Instead, each soldier served their individual one-year tour, known as the Individual Tour of Duty, ITD, and when the clock ran out, they were airlifted home. This procedural detail was catastrophic for the psyche. There was no slow, collective decompression, no long voyage home on a troop ship across the Atlantic, as veterans of World War II had experienced. The transition was instant and traumatic. A soldier could be in heavy combat on Monday, and by Wednesday, be walking through the gate at SeaTac, Fort Dix, or San Francisco International. The plane landed. The door hissed open, and the air that hit them wasn't the humid, sickly sweet air of the Delta. It was the chill, conditioned air of a country that had moved on, or was actively moving against them. David walked through that arrival gate, his uniform crisp, looking for a sign, a flag, a handshake, a simple acknowledgement of the year he had given. He found only hostility. He was met, not by gratitude, but by venom. Their rage was not directed at the politicians who started the war, or the generals who directed it. It was aimed squarely at the young men and women who had merely executed the orders of a divided nation. David, barely 20 years old, felt the instant, sickening shift of reality. He wasn't a veteran. He was a symbol. He had come home only to become a casualty of an invisible domestic war he was utterly unprepared for. The reception for the Vietnam generation was a moral and historical catastrophe. For the veteran of the Second World War, the war had ended with a decisive victory, a universal sense of purpose, and the GI Bill as a social contract of thanks. For the Vietnam veteran, the war was a source of national shame, and they were the most visible, tangible reminder of the failure. Their instructions from the government and the culture were simple: take off the uniform, cut your hair, and be quiet. This initial shock gave way to a deeper, more isolating burden, the feeling of being actively shunned. The shame of a lost, unpopular war was transferred onto the shoulders of the returning soldiers. The institutions designed to catch them did not merely falter, they collapsed entirely. The Veterans Administration, VA, was catastrophically unprepared. Its systems were still designed for the massive physical injuries of the world wars. They had no effective framework for the unique trauma of Vietnam, a war of counterinsurgency, blurring lines between combatant and civilian, fought in fragmented units and culminating in an abrupt, dishonorable homecoming. They were systematically dismissed. Their terrifying nightmares, their hypervigilance, and their blinding flashes of rage were often attributed to simple personality flaws or, in the most dismissive official language, an adjustment reaction to adult life. This was the crux of the institutional betrayal. By labeling their psychological wounds as an adjustment problem, the VA implied a personal failure, not a psychological injury inflicted by extraordinary, horrifying circumstances. The system that sent them to war now refused to acknowledge the cost of that service. This denial of pain created a crisis known as moral injury. It is the profound sense of having committed, witnessed, or failed to prevent acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs, often compounded by betrayal from trusted others or institutions. The final, devastating breach of trust occurred on American soil. The system that sent them to fight failed to fight for them when they returned. This rejection created a social and psychological chasm. The veteran found himself marooned on an island of his own experience, watching the rest of America float by in a wave of 1970s cultural upheaval. They were strangers in their own land. For the veterans, the war had not ended. It was simply transplanted like a lethal seed, into their civilian lives. The true enemy was now unseen, a phantom limb of paralyzing fear, paralyzing guilt, and explosive anger. They woke up screaming from nightmares that replayed the movie in their minds. They hit the floor when a car backfired, confusing it with incoming mortar fire. They could not hold a job or maintain relationships because they were emotionally absent, trapped in a constant state of hyperarousal. They self-medicated, a desperate, brutal attempt to quiet the overwhelming noise of silence in their heads, leading to rampant alcoholism, drug abuse, and family breakdown. The casualties mounted in silence. The statistics are horrifying, a tragic monument to institutional and societal negligence. It is estimated that more Vietnam veterans died by suicide in the 2 decades following the war than were killed in combat during it. The war's final, silent toll was taken in suburban bedrooms, lonely apartments, and on the streets where an unprecedented number of veterans became homeless. I never saw the enemy in Vietnam. The enemy followed me home. It slept in the bed beside me, and it told me I wasn't worthy of living. The American society, in its haste to close a painful chapter, created a new, devastating class of casualties, the unacknowledged wounded. They carried a war no one wanted to remember, fought a battle no one wanted to see, and suffered a pain no doctor had the language to describe. Their honor was stripped, their pain was denied, and their sacrifice was deemed irrelevant. A country cannot heal until its soldiers are healed. A society cannot reclaim its honor by denying the pain of those who served. These men and women were fighting the most consequential battle of their lives, a desperate struggle for their sanity, their dignity, and their rightful place in the American story, but they could not win it alone. The systemic failure that created their trauma also demanded a systemic solution. The question that hung, heavy and unanswered, in the smoke and quiet desperation of a million homes was this: how would the forgotten finally unite, challenge the institutional indifference, and force a deaf nation to finally hear the agonizing truth of their invisible wounds? The history of advocacy is not written by the powerful, but by the dispossessed. When a system fails those who need it most, the burden of change falls to the victims. The years of isolated suffering, the denial, the indifference, the labeling of genuine injury as personal failure, culminated in a collective refusal to be silenced. This was the antithesis, the moment the Vietnam veterans stopped waiting for a nation's permission to heal and seized control of their own destiny. The revolution began not in Washington, D.C., but in basements, VFW halls, and storefronts across the country. It was a grassroots uprising based on a simple, revolutionary principle. Only a veteran can truly understand a veteran. Unable to find solace or effective treatment within the antiseptic walls of the VA, veterans created their own therapy. These informal, peer-to-peer groups, known as rap groups, were sanctuaries where the military code of silence finally broke. They were places where the rage, the guilt, and the horror could be articulated without the judgment of a civilian doctor who had never seen combat. In the rap groups, they found something they had lost on the hostile tarmac: trust and validation. A common observation emerged: the symptoms were universal. These were not idiosyncratic failures. They were shared wounds. Among the pioneers who recognized this necessity was the prophetic figure, Dr. Khaim Shatan. Working with veterans in the late 1960s and early 70s, Shatan was one of the first psychiatrists to argue that the veterans' suffering was a direct, delayed consequence of their combat exposure and subsequent moral betrayal. He labeled this complex of symptoms post-Vietnam syndrome, recognizing that the existing medical language was actively harmful, erasing the legitimacy of their pain. Shatan and his peers validated the veterans' anger, identifying it not as antisocial behavior, but as a necessary moral protest against betrayal. This was the intellectual engine of change. The movement needed to move from grassroots to global. The first, and arguably most significant, catalytic event was the campaign to medically define their pain. Without a recognized medical definition, there was no mandated treatment, no compensation coverage, and no legitimacy. The fight was waged by relentless veterans advocates, supported by clinicians like Dr. Charles R. Figley and Dr. John Wilson. They lobbied the powerful American Psychiatric Association, APA, arguing that the VA's policy of denial was actively destroying lives. Their campaign hinged on a dramatic shift. They argued that the injury was not due to a weak personality, but was the result of a stressor outside the range of usual human experience. This advocacy culminated in a profound moment in medical history. In 1980, the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-3, was published. For the first time, a new diagnosis appeared: post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This was more than a technical victory. It was a revolution of legitimacy for the veteran. It validated the veteran's suffering, defining it not as personal failure, but as a normal, predictable human reaction to an abnormal, catastrophic event. The invisible wounds were finally given a name, and with that name came the possibility of mandatory treatment, the legal requirement for compensation, and the beginning of institutional accountability. This victory, born from the veteran's own self-help movement, fundamentally altered the course of military medicine for every generation of soldiers that followed. The second, equally defining catalytic event was the long, grueling battle for justice regarding Agent Orange. This was a fight not just for their minds, but for their very physical being and the future of their children. In the years following the war, veterans and their families began reporting a horrific, unsettling cluster of illnesses: cancers, heart disease, neurological disorders, and, most tragically, severe birth defects in their children. The U.S. government initially denied the link, insisting the chemical was harmless. The fight for Agent Orange recognition required a different kind of courage. It pitted the veterans against the massive, well-funded chemical companies, including Dow Chemical and Monsanto, and the immense political power of the federal government. The catalyst here was the 1979 Agent Orange product liability litigation. A small group of veterans and their wives, representing a massive class, sued the manufacturers. Visual cue. Text overlay. Agent Orange lawsuit, 1979-1984. The largest class action lawsuit in history at the time. The veterans faced an uphill, decade-long battle against scientific denial, but their collective voice, now unified, could not be ignored. In 1984, the companies agreed to an out-of-court settlement of $180 million. The legal victory was seismic. It forced the hand of Congress and the VA to conduct further studies, slowly, painfully, leading to the eventual, crucial presumption of service connection for a growing list of Agent Orange-related illnesses. The Vietnam veteran proved that they would not only fight for their minds, PTSD, but also for their ravaged bodies and the future of their children. The recognition of PTSD and the Agent Orange settlement proved that collective advocacy could move mountains. They had won the fight for legitimacy, but the trauma still lingered. The country was still divided. They had demanded recognition, but now they needed reconciliation, a monumental act of healing that required a shared national space. The fight for justice paved the way for the ultimate fight for honor. The final act of resilience is not the mere survival of trauma, but the forging of a legacy that ensures the next generation of soldiers does not suffer the same catastrophic fate. Having fought for their medical and legal rights, securing the diagnoses of PTSD and the recognition of Agent Orange injury, the Vietnam veterans undertook their greatest act of service. They built a bridge, a physical, emotional, and political structure between the American past and the American future. In the late 1970s, the lingering bitterness surrounding the war had created an emotional vacuum. The nation was desperate to move on, yet unable to heal. A former infantryman named Jan Scruggs, deeply troubled by the emotional silence surrounding the 58,000 dead, believed the nation needed a physical place to mourn, to reflect, and to finally separate the warrior from the war. Scruggs' vision, fueled by the tireless efforts of veterans and the $8.4 million raised entirely by private donations, culminated in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated in November 1982. The design, submitted by 21-year-old Yale architecture student Maya Lin, was a radical, controversial departure from traditional monuments. It was not a towering, triumphal arch, but a simple, profound V-shaped cut into the earth, faced with highly polished black granite. Lin's vision was ultimately embraced for its subtle, undeniable power. It was designed to be an experience of quiet, private reflection, not public proclamation. The genius of the wall is in the list. 58,120 names carved into the stone, arranged chronologically by date of death. As a visitor walks its length, the polished granite acts as a mirror, showing their own reflection superimposed over the names of the lost. The monument is literally a reflection of the nation's responsibility. The arrangement by date forces the visitor to follow the arc of the war, experiencing the rising and falling tides of loss, which is far more emotionally resonant than a simple alphabetical list. It became the ultimate mechanism of national reconciliation. It did not attempt to justify or celebrate the war. It focused entirely on honoring the sacrifice. For the first time since their return, veterans had a physical, tangible, and nationally sanctioned place to acknowledge their fallen comrades. They touched the names, etched them onto paper, and, in a powerful shared ritual, finally began to lay their ghosts to rest. I never knew I needed a tombstone until I saw it. It isn't the government's monument, it's ours. And every time I touch a name, I know he's home. He's finally home. The wall succeeded where all political rhetoric had failed. It initiated the slow, decades-long process of healing the national wound, establishing the enduring American principle: hate the war, but honor the warrior. The Vietnam veterans' deepest, most impactful act of enduring service was not about their past. It was about the future. Their final code of honor was ensuring that the next generation of American soldiers, those returning from the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, would not suffer the same catastrophic homecoming. As the global war on terror began, the Vietnam generation watched the deployment of the post-9/11 generation with a mix of fierce pride and profound dread. They saw the potential for the cycle of institutional indifference and public denial to tragically repeat itself. They refused to allow it. They mobilized to become the mentors, the advocates, and the institutional watchdogs. Their knowledge, hard-won through their own suffering, became the foundation of modern veteran care. Institutional reform. They served on VA boards, tirelessly lobbying Congress, ensuring that the lessons learned from the PTSD and Agent Orange struggles were codified into law and practice. They established the framework for modern vet centers, crucial community-based mental health clinics, peer support models. They refined and institutionalized the rap group models they pioneered in the 70s, establishing the template for the effective peer-to-peer support organizations that now help modern veterans transition. Breaking the stigma, they spoke tirelessly at military bases and universities, sharing their stories not as cautionary tales of defeat, but as blueprints for survival. They normalized the idea that asking for mental health help is an act of strength, not weakness. We didn't get a proper welcome home. We swore to God that the next generation of kids, whether they served in the desert or the mountains, would get the welcome and the care we never did. That is our redemption. The widespread modern understanding that PTSD is a legitimate, service-connected injury and the institutional improvements in veteran healthcare are direct, hard-won legacies of the Vietnam generation. When a soldier from the Iraq War steps off a plane today and is met with a grateful public, a handshake and ready access to advanced mental health services, that is not a spontaneous act of national gratitude. It is the institutionalized, enduring victory of the Vietnam veteran. The final, deep component of their legacy is the act of reconciliation, both foreign and domestic. The veterans' willingness to look beyond the domestic fight and engage with the world that had nearly destroyed them is the ultimate testament to the resilient human spirit. Many veterans returned to Vietnam not as soldiers, but as humanitarians and diplomats. They helped build clinics, clear unexploded ordnance, and engage in cultural and diplomatic exchange. They sought to heal the land and the people they had once been, ordered to fight, an act of profound self-therapy and international diplomacy that began at the personal level, at home. They worked tirelessly to heal the domestic political divide. The public perception of the Vietnam veterans slowly, painstakingly changed. The media, the government, and the culture finally began to separate the contempt for the war from the honor due to the soldier. Veterans were welcomed back into civic life, now recognized not as villains, but as the complex, resilient heroes they had always been. The story of the Vietnam veteran is not a footnote of defeat in American history. It is the definitive story of a second, far harder victory. The triumph of the spirit over indifference, the moral authority of the wronged. and the power of brotherhood to heal the deepest societal scars. They were sent to a faraway war, and when they came home, they were forced to fight another one, for their own sanity, for their place in history, and for the simple promise of a better life for those who would follow. They did not retreat. They did not succumb to despair. They organized. They advocated. They built the wall brick by granite brick, and then they stood guard over the future. The resilience of the Vietnam veteran is a universal testament to the unyielding refusal of good men and women to be broken by injustice. They taught us that true patriotism is not blind obedience, but the courage to relentlessly demand that one's country be worthy of the sacrifice made for it. And that is a legacy of honor that will endure forever.